The September morning air carried the scent of salt and fresh paint as Sarah Chin stepped through the imposing gates of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Her worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder, she walked with the measured pace of someone who had learned to observe before acting. The historic buildings stretched before her like monuments to maritime tradition, their brick facades weathered by decades of Atlantic storms and the dreams of countless officers who had passed through these halls. At 28, Sarah appeared unremarkable among the sea of new students gathering for orientation. Average height, lean build, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed nothing of personality or history. Her eyes, though, told a different story for those who bothered to look closely. They held a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond her years, a watchfulness that came from places where inattention meant death. The other students clustered in groups, their conversations filled with excitement about the prestigious program ahead. Many were fresh from undergraduate military academies, their uniforms crisp and their expectations high. Others were junior officers seeking advancement, their ribbons and insignia speaking of conventional military careers built in peacetime assignments and training exercises. Sarah kept to the edges of these gatherings, listening more than speaking, cataloging faces and voices with the automatic assessment skills that had kept her alive in the mountains of Afghanistan. She noticed the way certain students naturally gravitated toward positions of social leadership, how others deferred to those with more impressive backgrounds or family connections. The hierarchy was already forming, invisible but unmistakable. The registration process moved with military efficiency through the administration building. Sarah presented her orders and identification to a young ensign whose nameplate read Patterson. The young man's eyes scanned her paperwork with routine professionalism until something made him pause. His expression shifted slightly as he read deeper in her file, though his training kept his reaction minimal. "Welcome to the War College, Lieutenant Shun," he said with newfound respect. "You'll be assigned to Nimitz Hall, room 214. Your advisor is Commander Richards, and you'll meet with him tomorrow at 0800. Sarah nodded her thanks and collected her materials, noting how the ensign watched her walk away with curiosity. Her service record was mostly classified, showing only the basics of her 8 deployments and commendations. What wasn't visible in the official paperwork were the details that mattered most. The Taliban commander she had tracked through mountain caves, the hostage rescue operations conducted under fire, the intelligence network she had built and dismantled in regions where trust was a luxury few could afford. Nimitz Hall stood 4 stories tall, its red brick exterior and white-trimmed windows giving it the appearance of an elite boarding school rather than military housing. Sarah climbed to the 2nd floor, her boots silent on the polished hardwood floors. The hallway stretched before her, lined with doors bearing brass nameplate holders, most still empty as students settled into their new accommodations. Room 214 was small, but adequate. A single bed with military-standard linens, a desk positioned beneath a window that looked out over the quad, and a closet that would house her minimal possessions. Sarah set her duffel bag on the bed and began the process of organizing her space with the same methodical attention she had applied to preparing safe houses in hostile territory. As she unpacked, voices drifted through the thin walls from neighboring rooms. The conversations revealed the backgrounds and expectations of her fellow students. Discussions of family military traditions, debates about assignment preferences, speculation about which instructors would be most challenging. Sarah recognized the tone of young officers who had yet to face the true weight of command responsibility. A knock on her door interrupted her unpacking. Sarah opened it to find a tall, broad-shouldered student with the bearing and confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his insignia indicating a lieutenant commander rank that suggested either exceptional ability or exceptional connections. "I'm Brad Hutchinson," he said with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Just wanted to welcome the new arrivals to our little community here. I'm the student liaison for this floor, so if you need anything or have questions about how things work around here, I'm your guy." Sarah studied his face as he spoke, noting the way his gaze swept her room behind her, cataloging her possessions and making judgments about her background and status. His smile was practiced, the kind developed through years of using charm as a tool for manipulation and control. "Sarah Chun," she replied simply. "I appreciate the offer." Hutchinson's smile widened, but there was something predatory in his expression now. "Chun, interesting. What's your background? I don't think I've seen your name on any of the Academy graduate lists." The question carried implications beyond mere curiosity. Sarah recognized the probing nature of his inquiry, the attempt to establish her place in the social hierarchy he clearly dominated. Her silence stretched just long enough to make him uncomfortable before she answered. "Navy. Various assignments." The vague response clearly frustrated Hutchinson, who was accustomed to extracting information through social pressure and charm. His expression flickered with annoyance before the practiced smile returned. "Well, I'm sure we'll get to know each other better over the coming months. The program here is pretty intense, and it helps to have friends who understand the system." His tone carried a subtle threat beneath the friendly words. Some students find it challenging to fit in if they don't understand the social dynamics. Sarah met his gaze directly, her expression neutral but alert. In hostile territory, she had learned to identify threats quickly and accurately. Hutchinson represented a different kind of danger than the enemy she had faced in combat, but a threat nonetheless. His words carried the clear implication that her acceptance or rejection by his group would determine her experience at the War College. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After Hutchinson left, Sarah finished her unpacking while analyzing the encounter. The man was clearly accustomed to intimidating newcomers into submission through social pressure and veiled threats. His perfectly maintained appearance and confident manner suggested someone who had never faced genuine hardship or challenge. The way he had probed for information about her background indicated he was building a profile to determine her vulnerability to manipulation. That evening, the new students gathered in the mess hall for their first formal dinner as a class. The large room buzzed with conversation as groups formed and reformed around tables, the social dynamics of military hierarchy playing out through seating arrangements and conversation patterns. Sarah chose a table near the back, positioning herself where she could observe the room while maintaining a low profile. Hutchinson held court at a central table, surrounded by students who clearly sought his approval and acceptance. Their conversation was loud enough to carry across the room, filled with name-dropping and discussions of family military traditions and political connections. Several students at nearby tables strained to catch their words, hoping for an opportunity to join the prestigious inner circle. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed how Hutchinson and his group's attention turned towards students they deemed outsiders or easy targets. Their comments, while not directly confrontational, carried subtle mockery and exclusion. A young ensign from a small Midwest town became the target of jokes about his rural background. A female lieutenant commander who had earned her commission through the enlisted ranks faced questions about her unconventional path to officer status. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. These were not random social interactions, but calculated attempts to establish dominance through humiliation and exclusion. Hutchinson was building a power structure based on intimidation, using his charisma and social connections to create an environment where conformity to his standards was the price of acceptance. When dinner concluded and students began returning to their quarters, Sarah found herself walking the same corridor as several of Hutchinson's associates. Their conversation, clearly intended for her to overhear, centered on speculation about her background and fitness for the program. "I heard she's some kind of special operations type," one of them said. "Probably one of those military police investigators or something. She looks like she'd be more comfortable cleaning weapons than planning strategy," another added with a laugh. Sarah continued walking without reaction, but she noted their names and faces for future reference. These were the foot soldiers in Hutchinson's campaign of social dominance, eager to prove their loyalty through cruelty to those outside their circle. Back in her room, Sarah sat at her desk and began writing in a journal she had kept throughout her military career. The habit had started during her first deployment when a veteran sergeant had advised her to document her experiences for later analysis and learning. Tonight, She recorded her initial observations about the social dynamics at the War College and the potential challenges they represented. The irony was not lost on her that after surviving 8 combat deployments in one of the world's most dangerous regions, she now faced a different kind of warfare in the halls of her own military's educational institution. The enemies here wore the same uniform she did and used social pressure rather than bullets to achieve their objectives. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the choices ahead. She could attempt to integrate into Hutchinson's power structure, accepting whatever role he assigned her in exchange for social peace. She could maintain her current low profile, hoping to avoid conflict while focusing on her academic goals. Or she could prepare for the inevitable confrontation that seemed to be building with each passing hour. Outside her window, the lights of Newport Harbor twinkled in the darkness. Ships moved slowly through the channel, their navigation lights marking safe passage through waters that had seen centuries of naval history. Sarah understood that she stood at a crossroads in her own history, where the decisions she made in the coming days would determine not only her experience at the War College, but potentially the direction of her entire military career. The quiet that had served her so well in combat situations was being interpreted as weakness by those who had never faced real adversity. Soon, she would need to decide whether to continue that silence or reveal the steel beneath her unassuming exterior. Either choice carried risks, but Sarah had learned long ago that inaction was often the most dangerous choice of all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to assess the situation. For now, she needed rest and mental preparation for whatever conflicts lay ahead. As she turned off the light, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would not become another casualty of Hutchinson's campaign of intimidation, no matter what the cost. The morning reveille echoed across the Naval War College campus at 0530, rousing students from their sleep with the familiar urgency of military routine. Sarah had been awake for 30 minutes already, having maintained the sleep discipline developed during years of unpredictable combat schedules. She completed her morning physical training in the pre-dawn darkness, running the perimeter of the campus while most of her classmates still slept. The shower facilities in Nimitz Hall were communal, a design intended to foster camaraderie among students, but which often served to highlight social divisions. Sarah arrived early enough to avoid the morning rush, but as she finished her routine and prepared to leave, Hutchinson and 2 of his associates entered the facility. Well, Hutchinson said, his voice carrying clearly in the tiled space. The early bird gets the worm, I suppose. Though I'm not sure what kind of worms you're used to hunting, Sean. His companions, a stocky lieutenant named Morrison and a tall ensign called Redfield, laughed at their leader's joke. Sarah recognized the testing nature of the comment, designed to provoke a reaction that would establish her position in their social hierarchy. She finished gathering her toiletries without acknowledging the remark. Not much of a conversationalist, are you? Morrison added, stepping closer to Sarah's position near the sinks. Most people around here are friendly enough to respond when spoken to. Sarah turned to face the 3 men, her expression calm and neutral. Good morning, she said simply, then moved toward the exit. Redfield positioned himself partially in front of the doorway, not quite blocking her path, but making her passage deliberately uncomfortable. You know, Chun, we're trying to be welcoming here. The least you could do is show some appreciation for the effort. The move was calculated to test her willingness to be physically intimidated. Sarah recognized the tactic immediately, using proximity and implied threat to establish dominance without crossing lines that would trigger official intervention. She had seen similar behavior from enemy forces who used psychological pressure before escalating to physical violence. Rather than backing down or asking them to move, Sarah simply waited. Her stillness was absolute, the kind of perfect calm that predators recognize as danger and prey that might not be as defenseless as it appeared. After several seconds of uncomfortable silence, Redfield stepped aside with forced casualness. See you in class. Hutchinson called after her as she left, his tone suggesting their interaction was far from over. The first academic session was strategic planning and analysis, held in a lecture hall designed like an amphitheater with tiered seating that allowed clear sight lines between all participants. Professor Collins, a retired rear admiral with silver hair and sharp eyes, had a reputation for demanding excellence and accepting no excuses for mediocrity. Sarah chose a seat in the middle section, avoiding both the front row where eager students typically gathered and the back where those seeking to hide usually congregated. Hutchinson and his group claimed a prominent position in the front, their confident postures announcing their expectation of academic dominance. Today we begin our examination of complex strategic decision-making, Professor Collins announced as the session commenced. You will work in teams throughout this course, and those teams will be assigned randomly to ensure diverse perspectives and prevent the formation of comfortable cliques. Sarah noticed the flash of annoyance that crossed Hutchinson's face at the mention of random team assignments. His entire social strategy depended on controlling group dynamics through carefully managed alliances and exclusions. When the team assignments were announced, Sarah found herself grouped with Morrison, Redfield, a quiet female lieutenant named Jessica Park, and an enthusiastic ensign named David Kumar. The irony was immediate and obvious. She would be working closely with two of Hutchinson's key associates under circumstances that would test their professional capabilities rather than their social maneuvering skills. "Looks like we're teammates," Morrison said as the groups assembled for their first planning session. His tone was neutral, but Sarah detected the undercurrent of calculation as he evaluated this new dynamic. The assignment was complex. Develop a comprehensive strategy for naval operations in a hypothetical conflict scenario involving multiple allied nations and competing objectives. Each team member would be responsible for specific aspects of the analysis, with the final presentation requiring seamless integration of all components. As the team discussed role assignments, Sarah listened carefully to each member's background and capabilities. Kumar had strong analytical skills, but limited practical experience. Park possessed excellent technical knowledge, but appeared intimidated by the group dynamics. Morrison and Redfield clearly expected to dominate the team's decision-making process through the same social pressure tactics they used in other situations. "I think Morrison and I should handle the strategic overview," Redfield announced without consulting the other team members. "Park can work on technical specifications, Kumar can research historical precedents, and Chun can, well, we'll find something appropriate for her skill set." The dismissive tone was intentional, designed to establish Sarah's subordinate position within the team hierarchy. Park and Kumar exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent, unwilling to challenge the assumption of leadership by Hutchinson's associates. Sarah pulled out a notebook and began sketching a preliminary analysis framework while the others continued their discussion. Her approach was methodical, breaking down the complex scenario into manageable components and identifying critical decision points that would determine mission success or failure. Years of operational planning in hostile environments had taught her to see patterns and vulnerabilities that less experienced officers might miss. "What are you working on over there?" Morrison asked, noticing her focused activity. Sarah turned her notebook so the team could see her work. The framework was comprehensive and sophisticated, incorporating variables and contingencies that their initial discussion had overlooked entirely. Her analysis demonstrated an understanding of operational complexity that came from real-world experience rather than theoretical study. Park leaned forward to examine the framework more closely. "This is incredibly detailed," she said with genuine admiration. "How did you identify these integration points so quickly?" "Experience," Sarah replied simply. The single word carried implications that made Morrison and Redfield exchange uncertain glances. Their assumption that Sarah would be easily marginalized within the team was clearly incorrect, but they were unsure how to adjust their approach without losing face. "Well," Morrison said after a moment, "I suppose we can incorporate some of these ideas into our strategic overview." Sarah's framework became the foundation for their team's analysis, though Morrison and Redfield continued to position themselves as the project leaders despite contributing less substantive work. During team meetings, they would restate her recommendations in their own words, claiming credit for insights while treating her as a junior contributor. The pattern continued throughout their first week of classes. In each academic session, Sarah demonstrated knowledge and analytical capabilities that exceeded her classmates' expectations. But Hutchinson's group worked consistently to minimize her contributions and maintain their perceived dominance of the social hierarchy. The situation reached a turning point during their first major presentation. Each team would present their strategic analysis to Professor Collins and a panel of faculty members, with individual grades depending partly on peer evaluation of each member's contribution to the final product. Sarah had produced the bulk of the analytical work, but Morrison and Redfield planned to deliver the presentation themselves, relegating her to minor supporting roles. The night before their scheduled presentation, they met in a library to finalize their materials and rehearse their delivery. "I think we should stick to the plan we discussed," Morrison announced as they gathered around a conference table. "Redfield and I will handle the main presentation. Park will cover technical details. Kumar will present the historical context. And Chun she can answer questions if any come up." The dismissive assignment was clearly intended to minimize Sarah's visibility during the presentation while ensuring that Morrison and Redfield received credit for the team's success. Park and Kumar looked uncomfortable with the arrangement, but remained silent, unwilling to challenge the established power dynamic. Sarah had reached a decision point. She could accept the marginalization and focus solely on her individual academic performance, allowing Hutchinson's associates to claim credit for her work while avoiding direct confrontation. Alternatively, she could assert her rightful role in the team's success, potentially triggering the broader conflict that seemed to be building since her arrival. "I have a suggestion," Sarah said calmly. "Since I developed the analytical framework and conducted most of the operational planning analysis, I should present those sections myself. Morrison and Redfield can handle strategic overview and conclusions, which aligns better with everyone's actual contributions to the project." The suggestion was reasonable and fair, but it directly challenged the power structure that Morrison and Redfield had established. Morrison's jaw tightened as he processed the implications of her proposal. "I think our current plan works fine," he said firmly. "We don't want to confuse the presentation by having too many different speakers." "The presentation would be more effective if each person presented their own work," Sarah replied. "The faculty will ask detailed questions about the analysis, and I'm better positioned to answer them since I developed that component." Redfield leaned forward aggressively. "Listen, Chun, we've been trying to be accommodating here, but you need to understand your role on this team. Morrison and I have more experience with these kind of presentations, and, frankly, more credibility with the faculty." The mask was slipping away now, revealing the naked attempt to maintain dominance through intimidation rather than merit. Sarah recognized the escalation in their approach and understood that her response would determine not only the outcome of this specific conflict, but the broader dynamics of her time at the War College. Park spoke up unexpectedly, her voice quiet but determined. "Actually, I think Sarah's suggestion makes sense. She did do most of the analytical work, and her framework is really the foundation of our entire presentation." Kumar nodded in agreement. "Sarah's analysis is definitely the strongest part of our project. It seems fair that she should present herself." Morrison's face flushed with anger at this unexpected challenge to his authority. He had assumed that Park and Kumar would remain passive supporters of whatever arrangement he and Redfield established. Their willingness to side with Sarah represented a significant threat to the power structure he was trying to build. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But if this presentation falls apart because we're trying to accommodate everyone's ego, don't blame us when the grades suffer." The threat was clear. If Sarah insisted on presenting her own work, Morrison and Redfield would ensure that the presentation failed and blame her for the disaster. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to make the target choose between personal recognition and group success. Sarah met Morrison's angry stare with calm confidence. "The presentation will succeed because the analysis is solid and the strategic recommendations are sound. That's what the faculty will evaluate, not our internal politics." The comment struck home because it highlighted the fundamental weakness in Morrison and Redfield's position. They had contributed little of substance to the project and were dependent on Sarah's work for their success. Their intimidation tactics were effective only if the target was willing to be intimidated. The library session ended in tense silence, with the team members gathering their materials and departing without the usual collegial discussion. Sarah understood that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. By asserting her rightful role in the team's success, she had directly challenged Hutchinson's power structure and declared herself unwilling to be marginalized through social pressure. As she walked back to Nimitz Hall, Sarah reflected on the parallels between her current situation and the counterinsurgency operation she had conducted in Afghanistan. In both environments, small groups used intimidation and social pressure to control larger populations through fear rather than legitimate authority. The tactics were similar, even if the stakes were different. The confrontation had revealed important information about her adversary's capabilities and limitations. Morrison and Redfield were effective at social manipulation when dealing with compliant targets, but they lacked the flexibility and genuine leadership skills needed when faced with determined resistance. Their anger at being challenged suggested they were unaccustomed to having their authority questioned. More importantly, Park and Kumar's willingness to support her position indicated that Hutchinson's dominance was not as absolute as it appeared. Other students were clearly uncomfortable with the existing power structure, but had been waiting for someone else to take the risk of challenging it directly. The next morning would bring their presentation and the first real test of whether merit could triumph over social manipulation in the War College environment. Sarah had committed herself to a path that would likely escalate the conflict with Hutchinson's group, but she had also positioned herself to demonstrate that their intimidation tactics were ineffective against someone who refused to be intimidated. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reviewed her notes one final time, ensuring that her presentation would be flawless and her command of the material absolute. Tomorrow would determine whether her decision to stand up for herself had been wise, or whether she had simply painted a larger target on her back for future attacks. The presentation went flawlessly. Sarah's delivery of the analytical framework was crisp, comprehensive, and demonstrated a level of operational understanding that impressed both Professor Collins and the faculty panel. When they asked detailed questions about contingency planning and resource allocation, her responses revealed depths of practical experience that no amount of theoretical study could provide. Morrison and Redfield's portions of the presentation, while competent, paled in comparison to the sophisticated analysis that formed the project's foundation. The contrast was obvious to everyone in the room, and the faculty's questions focused heavily on Sarah's methodology and reasoning rather than the strategic overview that Morrison had expected to dominate. After the presentation concluded and grades were distributed, Professor Collins approached Sarah privately while the other teams prepared for their sessions. "Excellent work, Lieutenant Shun," he said quietly. "Your analytical approach shows real-world application that's rare among our students. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your background and potential research opportunities." The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah understood it would also intensify the conflict with Hutchinson's group. By demonstrating superior capabilities in such a public forum, she had directly challenged their narrative about her place in the academic hierarchy. That evening, the consequences began to manifest. Sarah returned to her room after dinner to find her door slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered locking it before leaving. Inside, her belongings had been subtly disturbed. Books moved slightly out of alignment, papers shuffled just enough to indicate intrusion. Her computer's position shifted by inches on the desk. Nothing was missing or obviously damaged, but the message was clear. Her private space was not secure, and those responsible wanted her to know they had been there. The violation was psychological rather than material, designed to create a sense of vulnerability and constant surveillance. Sarah documented the intrusion carefully, photographing the displaced items and noting the precise time of discovery. Her military training had taught her the importance of maintaining detailed records when dealing with adversaries who operated through intimidation rather than direct confrontation. The next morning brought a new escalation. During the breakfast formation, word spread quickly through the student body about an anonymous report filed with the Honor Code Committee alleging that Sarah had plagiarized portions of her team's presentation from classified military sources she had inappropriate access to through her previous assignments. The accusation was carefully crafted to exploit the secretive nature of Sarah's service record. Since her operational history was classified, she couldn't provide detailed evidence to refute claims about her access to sensitive materials. The Honor Code investigation process would require her to submit to questioning about her background and methodology, potentially exposing information that remained classified for national security reasons. Hutchinson's fingerprints were all over the strategy. The anonymous report avoided direct confrontation while creating bureaucratic complications that could derail Sarah's academic progress. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the investigation process would consume time and energy while casting doubt on her integrity among faculty and students. Sarah requested an immediate meeting with Commander Richards, her faculty advisor, to address the situation before it escalated further. Richards was a veteran destroyer captain with a reputation for fairness and direct communication, qualities that had made him popular among students seeking honest guidance about their careers. "Lieutenant Shun," Richards said as she entered his office, "I assume this visit is related to the Honor Code report that crossed my desk this morning." "Yes, sir. I wanted to discuss the allegations and provide context for my background that might not be apparent from my official records." Richards gestured for her to sit and pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. "I've been reviewing your file since Professor Collins mentioned your exceptional performance yesterday. Your service record is interesting, though most of the details remain classified above my clearance level." Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that she needed to provide enough information to refute the plagiarism allegations without revealing operational details that remained sensitive. "My previous assignments involved strategic planning and analysis in operational environments. The methodology I used in our team presentation was developed through that experience, not through access to classified documents. The anonymous report suggests you may have incorporated strategic concepts from classified operations manuals into your academic work," Richards continued. "Can you address that specific allegation?" "Sir, the analytical framework I developed uses standard military planning principles that are taught in professional military education programs. Nothing in our presentation contained classified information or methodologies that aren't available through unclassified sources." Richards nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected as much, but the investigation process requires formal documentation. You'll need to provide a detailed explanation of your sources and methodology for review by the Honor Code Committee." The bureaucratic burden was exactly what Hutchinson had intended, forcing Sarah to justify her capabilities through time-consuming administrative processes while creating doubt about her integrity. Even if she successfully refuted the charges, the investigation would mark her as controversial among faculty and students. "Sir, I'd like to know whether anonymous accusations are typically investigated with this level of scrutiny or whether my case is receiving unusual attention." The question was pointed, and Richards understood its implications. Sarah was asking whether the system was being manipulated against her specifically, rather than following normal procedures. "That's a fair question," Richards admitted. "Anonymous reports are usually screened for credibility before formal investigations begin. In this case, the committee may have been influenced by concerns about classified information security, which made them more cautious about dismissing the allegations." The explanation confirmed Sarah's suspicion that her classified background was being weaponized against her. Hutchinson's group had identified the one aspect of her service that she couldn't defend openly and structured their attack to exploit that vulnerability. Over the following days, the Honor Code investigation consumed significant portions of Sarah's time and attention. She was required to provide detailed documentation of her research sources, submit to multiple interviews about her methodology, and prepare written responses to increasingly specific questions about her analytical approach. Meanwhile, Hutchinson escalated his social isolation campaign. Students who had shown interest in working with Sarah found themselves excluded from study groups and social activities if they continued their association with her. The message was clear. Supporting Sarah meant risking their own social standing within the program. Jessica Park, who had supported Sarah during the team presentation, became a particular target of this pressure. Her study partners began canceling their sessions, and invitations to informal gatherings stopped arriving. When she attempted to join conversations in the mess hall, others would find excuses to leave or shift the discussion to topics that excluded her participation. "I'm sorry," Park said to Sarah after a particularly isolating day. "I want to support you, but I can't afford to be completely cut off from my classmates. I need their cooperation for future team projects." Sarah understood Park's position and harbored no resentment toward her withdrawal of support. The isolation campaign was designed to demonstrate the cost of opposing Hutchinson's power structure, and Park's capitulation served that purpose effectively. The psychological pressure was constant and multifaceted. Sarah's room continued to show signs of intrusion, though nothing was ever taken or obviously damaged. Her computer experienced mysterious technical problems that required time-consuming repairs. Study materials disappeared from library carrels she had reserved, forcing her to scramble for alternative resources before important deadlines. Each incident was minor enough to be dismissed as coincidence or accident, but the cumulative effect was significant. Sarah recognized the pattern as a classic campaign of low-level harassment designed to create stress and distraction without providing clear evidence of deliberate sabotage. The situation reached a critical point during a joint exercise simulation in the third week of the program. Students were divided into opposing teams and tasked with developing comprehensive operational plans for a complex hypothetical scenario. The exercise would span 3 days and culminate in formal presentations to a panel of senior officers visiting from the Pentagon. Sarah was assigned to a team led by Hutchinson himself, along with Morrison, Redfield, and several other students who had aligned themselves with his faction. The assignment was clearly intentional, placing her under Hutchinson's direct authority while ensuring she was surrounded by hostile teammates who could sabotage her contributions while maintaining plausible deniability. During the team's initial planning session, Hutchinson announced the role assignments with barely concealed satisfaction. "Chun, you'll be handling logistics coordination. Make sure our supply lines and support requirements are properly documented. Nothing too complex, just basic administrative work." The assignment was deliberately insulting, relegating her to mundane clerical tasks while assigning strategic planning responsibilities to students with far less experience and capability. Sarah recognized the trap. If she protested the inappropriate assignment, she would be labeled as insubordinate and unwilling to support team objectives. If she accepted the role, her talents would be wasted while Hutchinson claimed credit for any team success. "I think my experience would be better utilized in operational planning," Sarah replied calmly. "My background includes extensive work in complex mission development and execution." Hutchinson's smile was predatory. "I'm sure you think highly of your own capabilities, Chun, but I'm the team leader, and I make the assignments based on what's best for overall mission success. Unless you have a problem following orders." The challenge was direct and public, designed to force Sarah into either submission or open insubordination. The other team members watched the confrontation with obvious anticipation, waiting to see whether she would back down or escalate the conflict to a level that could trigger official intervention. Sarah understood that her response would determine not only her role in this specific exercise, but the trajectory of her remaining time at the War College. Hutchinson was gambling that she would choose to avoid confrontation rather than risk her academic standing, allowing him to marginalize her completely while demonstrating his dominance over a student who had previously challenged his authority. "I don't have a problem following lawful orders from competent leadership," Sarah said quietly. "But I do have concerns about team assignments that waste available capabilities and compromise mission effectiveness." The response was precisely calibrated, respectful enough to avoid charges of insubordination, but pointed enough to challenge Hutchinson's competence as a leader. The phrase, "lawful orders from competent leadership," carried particular weight in military culture, implying that orders could be questioned if they came from leaders who lacked the judgment to use available resources effectively. Hutchinson's face flushed with anger at the public challenge to his competence. "Are you questioning my leadership, Lieutenant?" "I'm questioning the logic of assigning personnel based on personal preferences rather than operational requirements," Sarah replied. "If logistics coordination is truly the most important role for team success, Then, it should be assigned to whoever has the most relevant experience. If operational planning is more critical, then assignments should reflect that priority. The argument was unassailable from a professional standpoint, but it backed Hutchinson into a corner where he would either have to admit his assignments were based on personal animosity rather than mission requirements, or allow Sarah to take a more prominent role in the team's work. Morrison attempted to rescue his leader from the dilemma. Look, Chin, we're all trying to work together here. Why don't we focus on getting the job done instead of arguing about who does what? I agree completely, Sarah said. Let's focus on optimal team organization for mission success. I'm willing to take whatever role best serves that objective. The response put the burden back on Hutchinson to justify his assignments based on professional criteria rather than personal preferences. His silence stretched uncomfortably as he searched for a way to maintain his position without appearing petty or incompetent in front of the team. Finally, he capitulated partially. Fine, you can work with Morrison on operational planning, but I expect full coordination with the overall team strategy, and I retain final approval on all recommendations. It was a compromise that saved face while giving Sarah an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the team's work. However, Sarah understood that Hutchinson's anger being forced into the concession would likely trigger even more aggressive retaliation in the future. The exercise progressed over the following 3 days, with Sarah working closely with Morrison to develop the operational components of their team strategy. Despite his personal hostility, Morrison was forced to acknowledge the quality and sophistication of her contributions when it became clear that their success depended on her expertise. By the final day of the exercise, their team had developed one of the most comprehensive and well-integrated operational plans in the program's history. Sarah's analytical framework provided the foundation for tactical decisions that maximized their available resources while minimizing vulnerability to enemy action. When the presentations began, Hutchinson claimed credit for the team's success while minimizing Sarah's contributions in his introduction. However, when the Pentagon panel began asking detailed questions about operational implementation and contingency planning, it became obvious that Sarah was the only team member who could provide substantive answers. Lieutenant Shun asked a visiting colonel after several minutes of inadequate responses from Hutchinson, "Can you walk us through your risk assessment methodology and explain how these contingencies would be implemented under different threat scenarios?" Sarah's response was comprehensive and demonstrated the kind of practical experience that impressed senior officers who had faced similar challenges in real operational environments. Her explanations revealed layers of sophisticated analysis that went far beyond the theoretical knowledge typically demonstrated in academic exercises. The colonel's follow-up questions became increasingly specific, probing details of operational security, resource allocation, and command structure that required intimate knowledge of how complex military operations actually functioned in hostile environments. Sarah answered each question with precision and confidence, providing insights that clearly impressed the entire panel. When the presentation concluded, the visiting officer's praise was directed primarily towards Sarah's contributions rather than Hutchinson's leadership or the team's collaborative effort. The recognition was professional and well-deserved, but Sarah understood it would intensify Hutchinson's anger and determination to retaliate. That evening, as students gathered in the mess hall to debrief from the exercise, Sarah noticed the hostile stares and whispered conversations that followed her movements. Hutchinson's faction was clearly planning their response to what they perceived as her public humiliation of their leader. The confrontation that had been building since her arrival was approaching its climax, and Sarah knew that the next phase would test not only her professional capabilities, but her willingness to defend herself against adversaries who were prepared to abandon all pretense of civilized conduct in their determination to destroy her. The weekend following the joint exercise brought an unusual quiet to the Naval War College campus. Most students had departed for brief Liberty visits to Boston or New York, leaving the residence halls largely empty except for those who chose to use the time for additional study or personal projects. Sarah had remained on campus, planning to use the solitude for focused research on her individual thesis project. Saturday evening found her in the library's restricted research section, working through classified strategic analyses that required special clearance to access. The facility was nearly deserted, with only the night security guard and a few dedicated students scattered throughout the building's multiple floors. Sarah was deep in concentration, analyzing patterns in asymmetric warfare that might inform her thesis on counterinsurgency operations in urban environments, when she became aware of footsteps approaching her corral. Looking up, she saw Hutchinson, Morrison, and Redfield walking toward her position with a measured pace of men who had made a deliberate decision to confront her away from witnesses. "Working late again, Chun," Hutchinson said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present during their previous confrontations. "Seems like you spend more time trying to impress the faculty than building relationships with your classmates." Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The restricted section was isolated from the main library, and the three men had positioned themselves to block her most direct escape route. Their body language suggested they had moved beyond psychological intimidation and were prepared for physical confrontation. "Just focusing on my research," Sarah replied neutrally, closing her laptop and gathering her materials with deliberate calm. Morrison stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "You know, we've been talking about your performance during the exercise this week. Seems like you have some pretty strong opinions about how things should be run around here." "I have opinions about effective operational planning," Sarah said, standing slowly and positioning herself where she could move in multiple directions if necessary. "That's what we're here to learn." Redfield laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "What you're here to learn is your place in the hierarchy. Some of us have been trying to teach you that lesson since day one, but you seem to be a slow learner." The mask was completely off now. These three men had decided that subtle intimidation and bureaucratic harassment were insufficient to deal with their perceived problem. They were prepared to use direct physical threats to achieve what their previous tactics had failed to accomplish. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said calmly. "I'm not interested in challenging anyone's position here. I just want to complete the program and advance my career." Hutchinson stepped forward, bringing the three men into a loose semicircle around her position. "The misunderstanding, Chun, is your belief that you can embarrass me in front of visiting officers and walk away without consequences. That kind of disrespect requires a response." Sarah's combat instincts fully activated as she recognized the transition from verbal threats to potential violence. Years of operational experience had taught her to read the subtle signs that preceded physical attacks. The shift in breathing patterns, the slight changes in stance, the way aggressors position themselves before committing to action. "What kind of response did you have in mind?" she asked, her voice remaining steady while her body prepared for multiple contingencies. Morrison answered by reaching into his jacket and withdrawing what appeared to be a small digital camera. "The kind that ensures you understand the importance of keeping your mouth shut about our conversation tonight." The implication was clear. They planned to create some form of compromising evidence that could be used to control her future behavior. Whatever they had planned would be documented for use as leverage against her if she attempted to report their conduct or resist their demands. Sarah's mind raced through tactical assessments and response options. She was outnumbered 3-1 in an isolated location with limited escape routes. Her adversaries were physically larger and had demonstrated willingness to escalate beyond verbal threats. However, they had also made several critical errors in their approach that created opportunities for effective response. First, they had underestimated her training and capabilities, assuming that intimidation tactics effective against typical students would work equally well against someone with extensive combat experience. Second, they had chosen a location that limited their own mobility as much as hers, making it difficult for all three to attack simultaneously. Third, they had revealed their intentions clearly enough that any defensive action she took could be justified as necessary self-protection. "Before we go any further," Sarah said quietly, "I want to make sure you understand what you're proposing here. Are you planning to physically assault a fellow officer to force compliance with your social preferences?" The question was designed to make them articulate their intentions clearly while giving them an opportunity to reconsider their course of action. Sarah hoped that forcing them to state their plans explicitly might make them recognize the serious legal and professional consequences of their proposed actions. Hutchinson's response eliminated any remaining doubt about their intentions. What we're planning, Chun, is to teach you a lesson about respect that apparently wasn't covered in whatever training program produced your attitude problem. By the time we're finished, you'll understand exactly where you stand in this program and what happens to people who forget their place. Redfield added his own threat while adjusting his position to cut off her potential retreat toward the emergency exit. We're going to make sure you have a very clear understanding of the social dynamics here. And we're going to document your education so you remember this conversation whenever you're tempted to step out of line again. Sarah processed the tactical situation one final time before responding. 3 opponents with clear hostile intent, isolated location, evidence of premeditation through the presence of recording equipment, and explicit threats of physical violence. Under these circumstances, any reasonable person would fear for their safety and be justified in taking defensive action. I need you to understand something before you go any further, Sarah said, her voice taking on a quality that hadn't been present during their previous confrontations. I've spent the last 8 years in places where people try to hurt me for a living. I've survived situations that would give you nightmares for the rest of your lives. If you continue down this path, you're going to discover that I'm not the person you think I am. The change in her demeanor was subtle but profound. The quiet, reserved student they had been targeting was gone, replaced by someone who radiated the kind of controlled lethality that came from extensive experience in life-or-death situations. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but her stance now suggested a predator rather than prey. Morrison apparently failed to recognize the warning signs. Is that supposed to scare us? We're not impressed by your tough girl act, Chun. 3 against 1 means your little attitude adjustment is going to happen whether you cooperate or not. He stepped forward aggressively, reaching towards Sarah with the apparent intention of grabbing her arm to control her movement. It was exactly the kind of mistake that combat veterans learned to exploit against untrained opponents who relied on size and numbers rather than skill and experience. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. She caught Morrison's wrist as he reached for her, using his forward momentum and her own precise movement to execute a textbook wrist control technique that sent him sprawling across the floor with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that threatened dislocation if he struggled. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and left Morrison face down on the library floor with Sarah controlling his movement through applied leverage on his captured joint. Her position allowed her to maintain control of one opponent, while keeping the other 2 in sight for potential follow-up attacks. Morrison, Redfield shouted, moving towards Sarah with the obvious intention of helping his friend. I wouldn't, Sarah said calmly, applying just enough additional pressure on Morrison's wrist to make him gasp with pain. If you continue your approach, I'll break his arm to free myself for defending against your attack. Military doctrine allows for escalating force when facing multiple assailants. Redfield froze mid-stride, suddenly, understanding that the situation had shifted dramatically from their expected scenario. The quiet student they had planned to intimidate had become someone who demonstrated professional-level combat skills and was clearly prepared to use them as necessary. Hutchinson stared at the scene in shock, apparently unable to process how their carefully planned confrontation had been reversed so quickly and completely. What the hell do you think you're doing, Chun? Let him go right now. I'm defending myself against an attempted assault, Sarah replied without releasing her hold on Morrison's wrist. Your friend here made the mistake of putting his hands on me without permission after explicitly threatening physical violence. Under military law and civilian criminal statutes, I'm justified in using reasonable force to protect myself. She increased the pressure slightly, making Morrison whimper. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from me and allow me to leave this library safely. In exchange, I won't break your friend's arm or file formal charges for attempted assault and conspiracy. The offer was more generous than their behavior deserved, but Sarah understood that escalating the situation further would likely create complications that could affect her own academic standing. Her demonstration of capability had achieved its primary objective, establishing that she was not a viable target for physical intimidation. "You can't just assault a fellow student and walk away," Redfield said, though his tone lacked conviction now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. Sarah's laugh was cold and humorless. "I just defended myself against 3 men who cornered me in an isolated location and explicitly threatened physical violence while carrying recording equipment for unknown purposes. Any reasonable investigation will conclude that I acted appropriately under the circumstances." She looked directly at Hutchinson while maintaining her control of Morrison. "But here's what I'm really going to do. I'm going to pretend this conversation never happened, on the condition that your campaign against me ends immediately. No more room invasions, no more honor code accusations, no more social isolation tactics. You leave me alone to complete my education, and I'll leave you alone to play your political games." The proposal represented a face-saving compromise that allowed both sides to avoid the serious consequences that would result from official investigation of the evening's events. Sarah had demonstrated that physical intimidation would not work against her. While offering Hutchinson an opportunity to withdraw from a confrontation, he was clearly unprepared to win. Hutchinson's pride warred with his recognition that continuing the conflict would likely result in his own destruction. Sarah's combat skills, combined with her academic performance and faculty support, made her a dangerous opponent who could inflict serious damage on his reputation and career if he forced her to defend herself through official channels. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "But don't mistake this for weakness, Chun. If you ever cross me again, you'll discover that there are other ways to deal with problems than direct confrontation." Sarah released Morrison's wrist and stepped away from all 3 men, maintaining her watchful posture until she could reach the library exit safely. "I hope that's not a threat of future retaliation, because that would constitute grounds for immediate reporting to the Honor Code Committee and Base Security." She gathered her research materials and laptop while keeping the 3 men in sight. "Remember our agreement. Leave me alone, and I'll extend you the same courtesy. But understand this clearly. I've survived 8 combat deployments in Afghanistan by never backing down from bullies, and I'm not going to start now." With that declaration, Sarah walked toward the library exit with the controlled pace of someone confident in their ability to handle any further escalation. Behind her, she heard Morrison groaning as he struggled to his feet and the whispered, angry conversation between the 3 men as they processed their defeat. The confrontation had achieved multiple objectives beyond simply ending their immediate threat. Sarah had demonstrated that she possessed skills and experience that made her a dangerous opponent in any kind of physical confrontation. More importantly, she had shown that their intimidation tactics were not only ineffective against her, but could result in serious consequences for those who employed them. As she walked back to her residence hall, Sarah reflected on the evening's events and their implications for her remaining time at the War College. The direct confrontation had ended Hutchinson's campaign of harassment, but it had also escalated their conflict to a level that made future coexistence more complicated. Hutchinson and his associates now understood that she was not the easy target they had originally believed, but they also harbored significantly more personal animosity toward her than before. Their future actions would likely be more subtle and carefully planned to avoid triggering another direct confrontation they were unprepared to win. Sarah had succeeded in protecting herself and establishing clear boundaries, but she had also revealed capabilities and training that raised questions about her background among those who witnessed or learned about the incident. Managing those revelations while maintaining her operational security would require careful attention in the weeks ahead. The next phase of her time at the Naval War College would test whether she could transition from defensive action back to academic focus while maintaining the deterrent effect of her demonstrated capabilities. The balance between appearing strong enough to discourage future attacks and seeming threatening enough to trigger preemptive action from her adversaries would require delicate navigation. For now, though, Sarah had established that she was not someone who could be bullied into submission through physical intimidation or social pressure. The message had been delivered clearly and unmistakably. She was prepared to defend herself against any threat, regardless of the source or the consequences. The quiet student facade was gone forever, replaced by someone who had shown the steel beneath her unassuming exterior. Whether that revelation would ultimately help or hurt her academic goals remained to be seen, but Sarah had no regrets about her response to the evening's threats. Some lines could never be crossed without consequences, and she had drawn those lines clearly for anyone else who might mistake her restraint for weakness. The aftermath of the library confrontation rippled through the Naval War College community with the speed and intensity that only military institutions could generate. By Monday morning, rumors and speculation had spread throughout the student body, though the actual details remained known only to those directly involved and a few witnesses who had observed the immediate aftermath. Sarah arrived at her first class to find the social dynamics had shifted dramatically overnight. Students who had previously avoided her due to Hutchinson's intimidation campaign now regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The whispered conversations that followed her movements carried a different tone than before. Where there had once been dismissive speculation about her background, there was now respectful uncertainty about her capabilities. Hutchinson, Morrison, and Redfield were notably subdued during morning formation, their usual confident banter replaced by careful attention to military protocol and studied avoidance of eye contact with other students. Morrison bore visible evidence of their encounter in the form of a bandaged wrist and slightly favored movement that suggested ongoing discomfort from his brief education in leverage techniques. Professor Collins opened his strategic planning seminar with an announcement that would prove significant for Sarah's future at the institution. I want to discuss an opportunity that has arisen for one of our students. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have requested a detailed analysis of counterinsurgency operations in urban environments, specifically focusing on lessons learned from recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Sarah's attention sharpened as Collins continued his explanation. This is a real-world assignment that will contribute to actual policy decisions at the highest levels of military leadership. The students selected for this project will work directly with Pentagon planners and have access to classified operational data from recent combat operations. The opportunity was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for, a chance to apply her practical experience to meaningful strategic analysis while demonstrating her value to senior military leadership. However, she understood that competition for such assignments would be intense among students seeking to distinguish themselves for future career advancement. The selection process will be based on academic performance, demonstrated analytical capabilities, and relevant background experience, Collins announced. Interested students should submit application materials by Friday, including a writing sample and detailed resume of their qualifications. After class, Sarah approached Professor Collins to discuss the opportunity in more detail. His office was filled with maritime artifacts and strategic texts that reflected his decades of naval service and academic research. Professor, I'm very interested in the counterinsurgency analysis project. My background includes extensive experience in exactly the type of operations that would be relevant to this research. Collins nodded thoughtfully. I suspected as much, Lieutenant Shun. Your performance in class discussions and written assignments suggest practical knowledge that goes well beyond theoretical study. However, I should warn you that competition for this assignment will be significant. Several students have already expressed interest, including some with impressive academic credentials and family connections. The warning was diplomatically phrased, but Sarah understood its implications. Hutchinson and his associates would likely apply for the assignment, and their social connections could influence the selection process despite their inferior analytical capabilities. I believe my qualifications speak for themselves, Sarah replied. If the selection is based on merit and relevant experience, I'm confident in my ability to contribute meaningfully to this project. Collins studied her carefully before responding. Your confidence is warranted based on your academic performance. However, I feel obligated to mention that there have been rumors about recent incidents involving conflicts between students. The Pentagon assignment requires someone who can work effectively within existing command structures without creating interpersonal difficulties. The concern was legitimate and professionally stated. Collins was essentially asking whether the conflict with Hutchinson's group would affect her ability to function effectively in a high-visibility assignment that required collaboration with senior officers and government officials. Professor, I've worked successfully with diverse teams throughout my military career, including situations involving significant personality conflicts and competing objectives. I understand how to maintain professional relationships even when personal dynamics are challenging. Her response satisfied Collins's immediate concerns, but Sarah understood that the library confrontation had created complications that extended beyond her immediate conflict with Hutchinson. Faculty members were now aware that she possessed capabilities and background experience that exceeded typical student credentials, raising questions about her actual service history and the reasons for her enrollment in the War College program. Over the following days, Sarah prepared her application materials for the Pentagon assignment with the same methodical attention she had applied to mission planning during her operational deployments. Her writing sample analyzed patterns in insurgent tactics that she had observed firsthand during multiple tours in Afghanistan, providing insights that demonstrated intimate knowledge of how asymmetric warfare actually functioned in complex urban environments. The challenge was presenting her qualifications honestly while maintaining operational security about specific missions and capabilities that remained classified. Sarah's service records showed her deployments and commendations, but concealed the actual nature of her work with special operations forces and intelligence agencies. On Wednesday evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Commander Richards knocked on her door with the formal bearing that suggested official business rather than casual conversation. Lieutenant Shun, I need to discuss some developments related to your application for the Pentagon assignment. May I come in? Sarah gestured for him to enter, noting the serious expression that suggested significant news. Richards closed the door behind him and remained standing, his posture indicating the gravity of whatever message he carried. I've received some inquiries about your background from the Pentagon officials reviewing applications for this project. Specifically, they want to understand the nature of your previous assignments and your access to information that might be relevant to their research requirements. The inquiry was both encouraging and concerning. Pentagon interests suggested that her qualifications had impressed the selection committee, but their questions about her background indicated they were conducting deeper investigation than typical for student assignments. What kind of information are they seeking? Sarah asked. Details about your operational experience, security clearances, and specific knowledge areas that might inform the research project. They're also asking about any ongoing obligations or restrictions that might affect your ability to work on classified material. Sarah understood the implications immediately. The Pentagon officials had recognized that her application demonstrated knowledge and experience that exceeded normal student credentials, and they wanted to understand her actual background before making selection decisions. Sir, my previous assignments did involve work that would be relevant to this research project, but most of the specific details remain classified. I have active security clearances that would allow me to access the materials they're describing. Richards nodded. That's what I suspected. The problem is that several other applicants have questioned the fairness of the selection process if you have access to classified information that give you an unfair advantage over students with conventional backgrounds. The objection had Hutchinson's fingerprints all over it. Unable to compete with Sarah's qualifications on merit, he was attempting to disqualify her through bureaucratic challenges that exploited her classified background. The strategy was sophisticated, arguing that her superior knowledge created an unfair competition rather than demonstrating superior qualification for the assignment. Sir, I would think that relevant experience and appropriate security clearances would be considered assets for this type of research project, not disqualifying factors. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely correct, Richards replied. However, the situation is complicated by concerns about maintaining equal opportunity for all students and ensuring that selection decisions are based on factors that can be evaluated fairly across different backgrounds. The bureaucratic language concealed the real issue. Political pressure was being applied to prevent Sarah's selection despite her superior qualifications. Hutchinson's social connections were being leveraged to create artificial barriers that would exclude her from consideration while maintaining the appearance of fair process. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. During her operational career, she had seen similar tactics used to marginalize effective personnel who threatened existing power structures. The approach was always the same: create bureaucratic obstacles that appeared reasonable on the surface, but were designed to achieve predetermined outcomes. "What would you recommend as my best course of action?" Sarah asked. Richards considered the question carefully before responding. "Honestly, your best option might be to withdraw your application and focus on other opportunities. The Pentagon assignment has become politically complicated, and even if you were selected, the controversy could affect your reputation and future career prospects." The suggestion was well-intentioned, but represented exactly the kind of capitulation that would validate Hutchinson's tactics and encourage future attacks against her or other students who refuse to conform to his social hierarchy. "Sir, with respect, I believe withdrawing would send the wrong message about the standards we expect for military assignments. If my qualifications are the best match for this project's requirements, then those qualifications should determine the selection outcome." Richards smiled slightly at her response. "I was hoping you'd say something like that. Between you and me, the Pentagon officials are impressed with your application and want to move forward with your selection. However, they need assurance that the controversy won't affect your ability to work effectively with their team." The revelation changed the entire dynamic of their conversation. Rather than being excluded from consideration, Sarah was apparently the preferred candidate, but Pentagon officials wanted confirmation that she could handle the political complications without allowing them to interfere with her professional performance. "Sir, I've worked successfully in environments where interpersonal conflicts and political pressure were significantly more intense than anything I'm likely to encounter in this assignment. Managing those dynamics is part of professional military service." 2 days later, Professor Collins announced the selection results during their regular seminar session. The Pentagon assignment for counterinsurgency analysis has been awarded to Lieutenant Shun. The selection committee was impressed with her qualifications and analytical approach to the research requirements. The announcement was met with mixed reactions from the student body. Several students offered genuine congratulations, recognizing the significance of the opportunity and the competitive selection process. Others, particularly those aligned with Hutchinson's faction, responded with barely concealed hostility and whispered complaints about the fairness of the decision. Hutchinson himself maintained professional composure during the announcement, but his expression revealed the depth of his anger and frustration at being outmaneuvered despite his political connections and social influence. After class, Sarah was approached by Jessica Park, who had distanced herself following the team presentation incident weeks earlier. Park's expression was apologetic as she congratulated Sarah on her selection. "I wanted to apologize for not supporting you more effectively during the team conflicts," Park said quietly. "I was worried about my own standing, but I realize now that I should have been more concerned about doing the right thing." The apology was genuine and reflected Park's growing understanding that accommodating bullying behavior ultimately enabled more aggressive tactics. Sarah appreciated the gesture, while recognizing that Park's change in perspective was largely driven by Sarah's demonstrated success rather than principled opposition to Hutchinson's methods. Over the following weeks, Sarah's work on the Pentagon assignment provided both professional satisfaction and academic validation. Her analysis of urban counterinsurgency operations drew heavily on her operational experience while incorporating theoretical frameworks from her War College coursework. The research contributed meaningfully to ongoing strategic planning while demonstrating her ability to bridge the gap between practical experience and academic analysis. The assignment also served to establish a reputation within the broader military community beyond the War College. Pentagon officials praised her work and recommended her for future research opportunities, creating career options that transcended the petty conflicts that had dominated her early experience at the institution. Hutchinson's response to Sarah's success was to withdraw from direct confrontation while maintaining his social influence over students who remained vulnerable to his intimidation tactics. He focused his attention on targets who lacked Sarah's capabilities or connections, continuing his pattern of bullying behavior while avoiding conflicts he couldn't win. The library confrontation and its aftermath had established clear boundaries that both sides understood and respected. Sarah had demonstrated that she would not be intimidated by social pressure or physical threats, while Hutchinson had learned that his usual tactics were ineffective against someone with genuine combat experience and professional competence. As the academic year progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly integrated into the intellectual community of the War College while maintaining her distance from the social hierarchies that continued to dominate student interactions. Her reputation was based on academic performance and professional capability rather than social connections or political maneuvering. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about navigating institutional politics in military environments where personal conflicts could affect professional opportunities. More importantly, it had validated her decision to stand up for herself against bullying behavior, demonstrating that principled resistance to intimidation was not only morally correct, but professionally advantageous in the long term. By the end of her first semester, Sarah had established herself as one of the program's most capable students while earning the respect of faculty members who recognized her unique combination of practical experience and analytical ability. The quiet, unassuming persona that had initially made her a target for Hutchinson's harassment had evolved into quiet confidence backed by demonstrated competence. The transformation was complete. The student who had arrived at the Naval War College as an apparent outsider had become a respected member of the academic community whose success served as an example for other students facing similar challenges. Her story would be remembered as proof that merit ultimately triumphed over politics when individuals possessed the courage to defend their principles and the capabilities to back up their convictions. The cadets who had picked the wrong target learned a lesson that would serve them well throughout their military careers. Appearances could be deceiving. Quiet confidence often concealed dangerous competence. And some lines should never be crossed regardless of perceived advantages in numbers or social position. Most importantly, they discovered that true leadership was earned through competence and character rather than intimidation and political manipulation. For Sarah Chun, the Naval War College had become what it was always intended to be, a place where future military leaders were forged through challenge, conflict, and the ultimate triumph of professional excellence over personal ambition. The quiet warrior had found her voice and claimed her place among the elite officers who would shape the future of American military strategy.